I've been using Sony cameras for a good while now, and now that I have finally upgraded from the amazing A7C to the A7C Mark II that you're looking at me through right now, do I regret it? Was it worth it? Or should you save yourself the money and stick with the compact classic? Well, let's get into it. What's up, my dude? Your friendly neighborhood Tony here, and welcome to the Spare Tech Room, where I try to channel the power of hyperfixation to hopefully help you make better tech choices. Now, in today's video, I'm going to go piece by piece and break down all of the major differences between the A7C and the A7C Mark II. And I'll let you know what I do and don't like about upgrading to the newer version. And finally, I'll let you know which I think is worth your hard-earned money. So without further ado, let's jump to the top-down view and get cracking. Okay, so here we go. We've got the original A7C over here on the left-hand side. That's rocking the kit lens here, so that way you can kind of tell it apart. And the A7C Mark II on the right side that has no lens attached, and it's got my little Peak Design tassels attached to that there, so that way you can kind of just tell which is which. Now, I am going to list a full kind of spec comparison in the description box below, so if you want to see exact details of the differences between the two cameras, you could jump down into there and check that out. Otherwise, let's go ahead and start with just kind of like a physical overview and comparison between the two, and I'll try to point out all of the major differences between them. So the first thing you're going to notice is that they look a lot alike. They are very, very similar in both size and appearance. One of the major differences, probably the biggest one that you're going to notice, is the grip itself. Now, this is the original A7C. The original grip here has these kind of almost polka dot little pinholes in it, whereas the new one has this leather grain that I do like a bit more. Also, the grip itself is deeper. I don't know if you can tell that here, but if you look at the specs, the grip on the new one does give you a little bit more to hold on to, which over the long haul, I think is going to be more comfortable for you to use. So I definitely do prefer the grip on the new one. I do want to mention, I have a base plate attached to the A7C Mark II. This is actually a really cool base plate that I picked up. You can buy one that comes from Sony, but it's way too expensive in my opinion. I'll link to this one in the description box below though. It's really great because it gives you just a little bit of extra grip at the bottom here for your pinky, and it's compatible with most camera mounts, so you're able to just slide it right onto your tripod. So I do really love that. I'll link to that in the description box below. But anyway, the grip itself is definitely better on the A7C Mark II, in my opinion, unless you want a smaller grip for some reason. Some people prefer that. Aside from that, at the very top, you are going to notice a little bit of different branding here. Here on the new one, it does say A7C Mark II, whereas on the old one, it just says Steady Shot Inside 4K. So that's another way to tell them apart right there. Let's go ahead and go to the front though. Again, going to look very similar. So much, in fact, that they both just say A7C on them. There is no Mark II indicator on the front. One other thing you'll notice up front here is the front dial, which is huge for especially people that like to do photography. You know, you like to have different dials to control your aperture, your shutter speed, your ISO. And the original A7C was woefully lacking that front dial here, and you do get that on the new version, which I absolutely love. That to me was a big sticking point into why I decided to upgrade. Now, if we spin around to the side, this is actually going to be quite similar here. You've got a lot of the same doors here to open up and check out your SD card slot. There's also a door here for the micro HDMI and headphone jack, as well as up top, I'll open that up, and that is going to be for your mic jack and your USB-C connector. Now, on the original A7C, let me switch over to that, you do have your SD card slot. At the bottom, you have a headphone jack, a micro HDMI, and your USB-C connector here, and at the top, you only have your microphone input. So they do switch it around a little bit. I don't know if I prefer it one way or the other. Either is totally fine for me. One thing I will say since we're here is that the USB-C on the A7C Mark II does do video out at 4K 30 frames per second, which is another major sticking point for me. That's another big reason why I wanted to upgrade to the A7C Mark II, is the ability to stream and use this as a webcam without the need of any kind of capture card. Now, the video that goes out through the USB port here does not carry over any of the picture profiles. So if you're using S-Log or anything like that, it's not going to go through. It will only send over no picture profile, which is fine because the standard kind of setup, the standard picture profile on the new Sony cameras, I think is really good. So if you're just using to use this as a webcam, quick and easy, just a USB-C cable right to your computer will do it. Whereas with the original A7C, that was not the case, at least not to the level of 4K 30 that you get out of this new one. So big difference there. For me, that was a major sticking point. Okay, another thing I do want to touch on real quick, and this is just kind of a nitpicky thing, but it makes a difference, is the eyelets on the side of the A7C versus the A7C II. And of course, I have my little Peak Design things attached here. The eyelets on the original A7C are a bit jangly, so they are going to make a fair bit of noise just in day-to-day use, whereas on the A7C Mark II, they are much more tight and they don't jangle around. So if you're trying to shoot silently, it's small, but to me, that does make a difference. Okay, I'll also say on the other side of the camera here, there's nothing really going on there, so nothing of note. On the top, we'll do that next, and then we'll get to the back where all the bells and whistles are. But at the top, you're going to notice a couple of quick differences here. One is that they did move the shutter button and increase the size of it on the newer version. So that is slightly different. I don't think it's going to make much of a difference at all in day-to-day use. It might take a little getting used to if you're swapping over, but aside from that, no major difference there. It's kind of arbitrary in my opinion. You, of course, do have the video record function here, which doubles as another custom key. So I like to use that for Super 35 mode personally, but you can, change that to whatever you want it to be. A couple of other big difference here, though, at the top. One is going to be the EV dial. Here you have kind of hard stops between, plus and minus, going anywhere from +3 to -3, whereas this kind of has an endless scroll on the new version, and you can set this to be whatever you want it to be. So it doesn't necessarily have to be exposure compensation. It can be anything for that matter. So just a little different there. I like that you have more customization. I think that's great. Although I didn't really have a problem with having the kind of physical numbers printed in here and having it specifically for exposure compensation. What I do love and what I think is a massive difference between the old and the new is this dial here, or rather the switch below it. So if you notice here, you have the ability to switch between S and Q, which is slow and quick mode, so slow motion. You have video and you have photo, and you can toggle between the three of them on the fly, whereas on the original, you did not have that option at all. And this is massive for the new A7C Mark II, specifically because you can set your own settings for photo and for video and have them stick without having to go in and adjust anything when you're swapping between the two. Whereas in the older one, you would have to do that, which was so annoying if you're a hybrid shooter and you're trying to swap quickly from video into photo, and then you have to change your shutter speed and your picture profile and all that stuff. You can lock it in on the new version and just toggle between with the flip of a switch. It is amazing. And again, a huge, huge factor into why I decided to upgrade to the A7C II. Okay, and let's go ahead and go into the back side of the camera here. Now, we'll get into the menu and the specs and all of that, but I just want to show you some of the buttons here. One is the EVF is similar in size, although you do get better magnification on the A7C II, so a little bit better EVF there. Also, the screen is going to have a little bit of a better resolution, but we'll get into that a little bit more later on. You'll notice the buttons are very similar, except you have one extra button on the A7C II, another custom button that you can program to whatever you want it to be. Aside from that, everything else is pretty much the same on the back. I do feel like with this new leather grip that you have, it's a little easier to hold on to. There is a small lip here for your thumb to rest on, whereas you get a similar resting point here on the original A7C, but it's more slick. So I feel like the grip is just overall better here, both in the front and in the back where your thumb will go. Okay, let's talk about some of the different internal settings and menus and things like that. As I mentioned, you are going to get a higher resolution EVF and a better screen on the A7C Mark II. You also have better autofocus. It has the options to select a car, a plane, a train, or even an insect autofocus. There is something called AI auto framing, which you can set your camera on a tripod and it will follow you around and keep you in the frame. So if you're a single shooter, that could be pretty helpful. You have variable shutter on the A7C Mark II. So if you're dealing with any flickering lights or a TV screen that flickers on camera, it will allow you to adjust the shutter in smaller increments to kind of accommodate for those flickering lights. You have focus breathing compensation on the A7C II. Now that's of course only compatible with select Sony lenses. So if you have Tamron, Sigma, or any other type of lenses. It's not going to work with those, but still good to have. The megapixel count is going to be a big difference between the two. The original A7C has 24 megapixels as opposed to 33 megapixels on the A7C II. Now, that doesn't just mean that your pictures are going to look better. Once you get to a certain point in megapixels, it's not going to make much of a difference in your picture quality. But where it will make a big difference is your ability to crop into your pictures. So not to say 24 megapixels is bad, that's still great, but with 33, you're able to use the same lens and crop in even further on the image. So that is really helpful to have. And if you're looking to minimize the amount of lenses that you have to carry around with you, having more megapixels is going to make a big difference. You do also get the new color science on the A7C II, as well as the updated menu system, which I love. The new menu, I think it's great, so much easier to use. The screen itself is touchscreen, whereas it is touchscreen on the A7C, on the original one, but you have much more touchscreen functionality on the A7C II. You can load custom LUTs into the A7C II. You can record in 4K up to 60 frames per second, whereas on the A7C, the original, you can only go up to 30 frames per second. Now, I will say the 4K 60 frames per second does have a crop factor on the A7C II, so if that's a big deal to you, then you may want to look at other cameras, but I think it's totally fine. And again, is going to make a big difference between it and the original A7C. Another huge video factor on the A7C II is the ability to record in 422 10-bit, whereas the A7C, the original, only goes up to 420 8-bit. So you're going to get much better dynamic range out of the A7C II with your video. It's going to be much easier to color grade as well. And I've noticed that immediately because I do love to color grade my videos just a little bit. I don't go too crazy with it, but you can color grade the 8-bit footage on the A7C. You just have to make sure that you have it exposed perfectly as far as the lighting, or as close to perfect as you can get it. And so if you're in a studio environment like I am here, then it might be fine to go with the A7C with the 8-bit video footage. But if you are running and gunning, if you're out there in the streets trying to record in S-Log, then you're going to want as much dynamic range as you can possibly get, which is why you're going to want to go with something like the A7C II. You also get better in-body image stabilization on the A7C II. You get 7 stops versus 5 stops, which is actually a very big difference, especially if you're trying to shoot at lower shutter speeds and or be able to shoot in darker environments. That additional 2 stops of IBIS is going to make a really big difference. I think those are all the major differences between the two cameras. I will say, and we did look at it earlier, one of the big negatives to a smaller camera like this is that they do only have one SD card slot. That does not change in either camera. So if you are a professional shooter and you like to have that redundancy of a second card slot, then you may want to look at some other cameras, maybe the A7 IV. As far as pricing is concerned on these two, I've found them both used and new. Generally, the price gap between them is going to be somewhere around $600, give or take. I'll go ahead and link to both of them in the description box below. I'll try to find the best prices out there right now. So if you want to check that out, jump down into the description box and take a look at those links there. I think I've seen the A7C for around $1,300 and the A7C II for under $2,000. So I'll drop both of those links in the description box below. But all right, let's wrap up. So, okay, which one do I recommend? The A7C or the A7C Mark II? Well, if you've listened to everything that I've had to say about the two cameras and how the A7C Mark II is better in all these different ways, and that sounds like something that you want to get into, and of course, if you can afford it, then absolutely, by all means, I highly recommend the Mark II. But if you can't quite afford that just yet, do I recommend that you go with the A7C instead? And here's the kicker. Not really. Don't get me wrong. The original A7C is a great camera. I had a wonderful time using it for the years that I had it. But right now, for around that same price, there are a couple other cameras on the market that I think are going to be way better in so many different ways. And those are, well, one, if you're trying to stay in the Sony ecosystem, the Sony A6700. Right now, that's priced somewhere between $1,300 and $1,400, so right around where the original A7C is priced at. Now, of course, I know that it's not full frame, but when you look at some of the newer cameras, the crop sensor cameras, and compare them to something that's a bit older, like the original A7C, you'll find that full frame frame versus crop sensor is not that big of a difference, if any at all. Now, if you're not hooked into the Sony ecosystem, I do also recommend the Fujifilm X-S20. I actually did a full video breaking down what I think about that camera. Again, it's another crop sensor camera, so it's not going to be full frame, but the picture quality and all of the bells and whistles that you get with either the A6700 or the XS20, in my opinion, are totally worth it. So I'll link to my Fujifilm XS20 video right over here at the end of this one if you want to jump into that and check that out next. If you have any questions about the A7C or about the A7C II or even about the Fujifilm camera that I just mentioned, definitely let me know in the comments below. I want to say thank you so much to the 260 people that have decided to join me on this journey. I appreciate every single one of you for subscribing, and I'll catch you next time in the Spare Tech Room. Be good.